Hello, and welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's episode, we're going to be going over Part 1, Chapter 5 of George Orwell's classic 1984. Let's see what happens next, shall we? Alright, this chapter starts off with Winston standing in line at the lunchroom, waiting to grab some lunch. From behind him, a voice speaks up and says, "Ah, just the man I was looking for." As Winston turns around, he sees his friend Sym. Winston describes Sym as a small character with large round black eyes and seemed to be examining everything all the time. Winston goes on to say that Sym was a philologist and that he specialized in news. In fact, he was on an enormous team of experts who were trying to compile the 11th edition of the Newspeak dictionary. He asks Winston if he had any razor blades, to which Winston responds that he doesn't and that they no longer exist. Winston tells the reader that in fact he actually has two that are unused and he keeps saved up. That's because at any given moment the party can run out of necessities, and they may not be able to be bought or found anywhere except on the free market, which was somewhere that people of the party were never supposed to go. Winston says that by Sym asking him for razor blades, he was actually trying to question him and see if Winston would have given him any details that he could use against him. Sym also asks Winston if he went to go see the hanging of the prisoners yesterday, to which Winston indifferently said that he was working and he wasn't able to see it, and that he supposes he'll see it in the flicks very soon. Winston also remarks that every time his eyes were on him, it's as if he could read Winston's face, saying, "I know you. I see through you. I know very well why you didn't go see those prisoners hanging." Sym tells Winston that he missed a really good hanging and that some of his favorite parts about hangings are when people kick their feet and how blue their tongue gets after they die. After this, it's their turn in line to get lunch. They grab the greasy trays and they put them on the counter and their food is put on it. A little bit of stew, a cube of cheese, a crust of bread, and a cup of coffee without any milk in it. Sym tells Winston that there looks like there's a few seats open underneath the nearest telescreen, but first they should get a cup of gin. And then they go sit down. They grab a small thing of gin and make their way to the tables and begin to sit down. Winston looks at his cup of gin and takes a breath, and then gulps down the oily substance where he can feel it inflaming his insides. After he wipes away the tears from the gin, he realizes that he's hungry and begins to eat. Both of them begin to eat without saying a word, and as they're finishing up, Winston can overhear some sort of chattering from the table right next to them. Winston asks Sym how the dictionary is coming out, to which he responds that it's working very slowly. He says that the 11th edition is going to be the definitive edition of Newspeak. He said it's going to be so thorough, in fact, a lot of people are going to have to relearn the language when the dictionary comes out. He talks about how they're cutting words left and right that are superfluous or don't really have a meaning. He goes on to explain to Winston in an example of the word good, to which he said, why should we have words like bad when instead we can just use ungood? Or instead of saying excellent or better, you can just say plus good or double plus good. That way you're still keeping the original word, just adding on to it. Sym tells Winston that he loves the destruction of language and loves the cleaning and simplifying of Newspeak. He then goes on to say that out of every language, Newspeak is the only one that every year words are cut and it gets smaller and smaller. He asks Winston, did he know this? To which Winston says yes, of course he knew this. Sym tells Winston that the newer versions of Newspeak are all the idea of Big Brother. At hearing the mention of Big Brother, a vapid eagerness flitted across Winston's face, but it also lacked a certain amount of enthusiasm. Sym picked up on this, and he tells Winston that he notices he doesn't have an appreciation of the language. He says that Winston still likes to think in old speak. He says he knows this because he's read some of the pieces that Winston has written. And in the Times, they're all good, but merely just translations. And he says that Winston still has a fondness for the old language. Sym then gets excited, and we learn the real reason as to why Newspeak is being adapted every year, and that is how they create the quote-unquote perfect language. The goal of the party and of Newspeak is so that people won't be able to think for themselves. They won't be able to think at all. Form words, they won't be able to form ideas of their own or independence because there'll be no words for them to use. All of the words in their vocabulary will be from Newspeak, and they'll only be able to think as they're told. He also mentions that it'll be wonderful, and that by 2050, not a single human being alive will be able to understand a conversation that they're having right now. Winston begins to say except, but then stops his sentence because he has a feeling that it really isn't going to go anywhere. Sym seems to be able to read his mind and says the proles are not human beings at all. He goes on to say that Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, Byron will only exist in Newspeak versions. Not only that, but they'll be changed into something different, something contradictory of what they used to be. We then learn the final point of this, and that is there will be no thought. Orthodoxy means not thinking, not needing to think. Orthodoxy is unconsciousness. After this conversation, Winston thinks to himself that Sym will one day be vaporized because he's highly intelligent and speaks too plainly and directly for the party. After they fall silent, Winston can hear the same talking from earlier coming from the other end of the table. He looks over and sees that it's the man who was roughly in his 30s with a thick muscular neck, and that for the entire time he has not stopped talking. The woman he's talking to has been agreeing with everything he says, but the man still won't let her speak. Winston remarks that all of these noises coming from this man's mouth don't really sound like words. He caught a snippet of the conversation to where the man said that Goldstein-ism needs to end and hopefully will end very soon. Winston goes on to tell the reader that the rest of what he's saying just sounds like words coming out of his mouth, and that from one's just collective intelligence could probably figure out that he was talking about the items of the parties approved of, or about war or other things, and essentially how this person probably wasn't even really a person. He seemed almost like a dummy of the party, just to spew out their ideologies. Sym speaks up and asks Winston if he knows that there's a new word in Newspeak called duck speak, and that's essentially the quacking of like a duck, and he applies it to the conversation that currently is going on. Winston then again thinks there is no doubt that Sym will be vaporized, and what was kind of sad and ironic is that he was so believing in the principles of the party and had a restless zeal with all the information of the party that he couldn't see his own demise. Winston also says that Sym likes to hang out at the Chestnut Tree Cafe, which is where a lot of painters and musicians go. Winston says that there is no written or unwritten law about this cafe. However, the old discredited leaders of the party had been used to gather there before the final purge, and Goldstein himself, it was said, had been seen there decades ago. The reason Winston doesn't tell Sym any of this is because Winston knows that if Sym were able to read his face or his thoughts, in a heartbeat he would turn against him and turn him into the thought police, with no hesitation in doing so. Just then, Parson walks into the lunchroom and makes his way towards the table where Winston and Sym were sitting. Winston can tell that Sym was not happy with Parsons, nor did he particularly like him. As Parsons got to the table, he pulled out a strip of paper with words on it, began to work on it with his pen. Parson lets Winston know that he owes him $2 because of Hate Week, and how this fund was going towards flags that they would fly during that week. Winston hands him the money, and Parsons enters this notation into his notebook. Parsons also apologizes for his son shooting Winston with the catapult yesterday. Parsons says it's probably because he wouldn't let his son go to the hanging, and he was upset. Parson then again reassures Winston that he gave his son a good talking to, and that if his son ever did it again, he would take his catapult away from him. Parsons then goes on to talk about how he's proud of his daughter and the fact that this Saturday previous, her and a few select friends went out on the trails with their troops, followed by a stranger. They tracked him down and turned him over to the police due to the fact that he was wearing funny shoes. He mentions of how proud he is of his daughter and that she's very smart for her age of 7. Winston asks what happens to the man, and Parson only responds with the motion of shooting a gun and clicking his tongue for the bullet. Sym offhandedly mentions that that's good and that they shouldn't take any chances. Just then a trumpet blast comes from the telescreen, and the Ministry of Plenty comes on and tells everyone about their exciting triumphs. The Ministry of Plenty says that not only are they having record-breaking production numbers, but the quality of life is actually increasing by 20% thanks to Big Brother. As Winston is listening to all of this, what strikes him odd is the fact that everything the ministry is saying is in fact not true, but is a huge lie. Not even 24 hours earlier, the telescreen announced that the chocolate rations would be going from 30% down to 20%, but that now Big Brother was raising the rations of chocolate to 20%. He makes mention of the fact that the reason all of this strikes him odd, as he's looking around at everything inside the room and the tables and the people, is that maybe it's because he's old enough that he's had some ancestral memory of a different type of life, and all of that just strikes him odd. He also has a hard time believing anything the party says, unlike a lot of people in the exact same room he's in. Winston mentions that not only Parsons but also Sym seems to be accepting all of this quote-unquote news as truth, and wonders if they themselves believe it or not, or if they're just following along. However, as Winston is looking at both of them, he realizes that they actually do believe it all. After the announcement, Parson praises the ministry and says they have been really succeeding as of late. He then asks Winston for razor blades, to which Winston responds the same as he did to Sym, that he didn't have any, and has been using the same one for about 6 weeks now. Winston also notes that the voice that had been talking earlier non-stop had stopped during the announcement, but now picked up again. As Winston was sitting there and listening to Parson speak, he couldn't help but think of Miss Parson and those awful children of theirs. He thinks that it will not be long before the children turn on their mother and have her vaporized. Then he mentions that he has a feeling he knows exactly who will be vaporized in the future. He says that he believes Miss Parsons, Sym, and himself will all end up being vaporized. Parsons, however, the small beetle-like people who run the ministry, and the dark-haired girl from the day earlier, from the 2-Minute Hate, will not be vaporized. Winston also mentions that sitting not too far away is the same dark-haired girl from the day previous from the 2-minute hate. He can't help but feel that she has somehow followed him and is trying to catch him off guard. This happens because he's looking around, he sees her staring at him. He then becomes anxious and tells the reader that anyone can be turned in for anything, especially during announcements, if their face happens to wander or drift off, or if they're thinking of something else. He even says that in newspeak there's a crime called facecrime, and that's if your face holds some sort of secret or if you're muttering something under your breath during what's supposed to be good or happy news. In the end, she turns back around and he continues to listen to Parson. Parson says that his daughter brings home an earphone so that way she can listen through the keyholes of other people's conversations. He also tells them a story of how his kid set fire to one of their neighbors due to the fact that she wraps sausages in posters of Big Brother. Parson then brings about all the training that the kids have received and how it's better than when he was in the spies himself. The whistle then goes off, everyone's heading back to work. All three of the men spring from their seats, and the one remaining cigarette that Winston has, the tobacco falls out of it. This is where Chapter 5 ends. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, stay lit.